Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here in our beautiful city. My name is Catherine Sorensen. I am the Director of Research at the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University. I will be your panelist today. I need to also mention to you that the reason I was chosen as your panelist today is that I used to run the water and wastewater utilities for the city of Phoenix. So I have... Hi, Phoenix guys. So I have extensive experience managing water in our desert climate, and I will be joined by some other experts for their perspectives as well. One of my roles here today is to frame our conversation and to give you some idea of the sense of place here. So you may have noticed, and if you haven't yet, you will soon, that yeah, we're in the middle of the desert and it's hot here. And these facts are used often by the East Coast media, reporters from temperate climates, to paint our water and energy needs in a negative light. And I will just tell you that irritates me. I'm from here, and I guess I'm defensive of my desert city. But it irritates me because that framing is incorrect. Of course, we know we're in the desert. It's hard not to know that on a hot summer day. And we've never had the luxury of taking water for granted. And so we plan very methodically and very carefully for our water supplies in our desert city. And I think people often forget, so it's worth reminding you. Desert cities are among the oldest cities on this planet. People have always lived in deserts. They will always live in deserts. And prosperity belongs in all climates. I will also ask you, when you have time, to look up an editorial I wrote for the Wall Street Journal in defense of my desert city. We don't have time to go into all the details of why I wrote this and what it says, but I'll just give you a teaser. It says, Phoenix is in no danger of running out of water. And so that's one of the things that we'll be talking about on our panel here today. It's important to understand that Phoenix was very carefully chosen. Phoenix is where the state's main rivers come together. And our modern canal system that Leslie Myers will be talking about is based on an ancient canal system that was developed by Native Americans who managed to use that canal system to irrigate vast fields of crops here in our desert region. We have imported Colorado River water from western Arizona near the border with California. We have very large and productive groundwater aquifers that sort of serve as our savings account for times when surface water is short. And of course, we have long understood the value of reclaimed water. We reclaim our wastewater, and much of it actually gets delivered to the country's largest nuclear power plant, where it is used for cooling purposes at the Palo Verde nuclear power plant. That is the only nuclear power plant in the world that is not located on a major body of water. And it is out here in the middle of our desert environment, providing the benefits it does because we understand the value of water and because we plan methodically for it. Yes, it is true that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. Honestly, I hope you enjoy a little bit of both tonight. Maybe a little whiskey and maybe a little fighting. Who knows? It is true. We do fight about water, but more importantly, we collaborate. Tribes, cities, private water companies, mines, power companies, farmers, irrigation districts, we all have to collaborate and innovate and find a way to make things work out here in our environment. People often ask, is there enough water and energy to support population and economic growth in Phoenix? I think you know my answer, but I also want you to understand that this framing is somewhat misguided. Really, what we need to think about is that what we do with our land is what we do with our water and energy. So we need to think about these problems in terms of what are the uses of land that we most value and that are worth then the water and energy to sustain those uses. I don't have an answer for that. That's a public policy question. But I would put forward that is a public policy question, not just for desert climates, but for cities and communities across the globe. Okay, with that, I'm going to introduce our panel, and we're going to have a fun conversation. First up is Glenn Williamson. He is the CEO of the Canada-Arizona Business Council. If you would please give him a warm welcome. And Leslie Myers, who is the Chief Water Executive of the Salt River Project. And then Laurent Germain, who I have just met, who is a fantastic person, CEO of Aegis. Please welcome Laurent.
Boy, those lights, right?
Okay. Thanks, you guys. All right, before we really get started, if you guys would please just take a minute to briefly describe what your company does and what your role in that company is, so people have context.
Certainly. Want me to start?
Please.
So I run the Canada-Arizona Business Council. To put that in perspective, we have 500 Canadian companies in the state of Arizona and one of the largest investors in the state of Arizona as well. And I was one of the individuals that brought EPCOR down here 12 years ago as chairman and helped build out our water projects in the state of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. I work for the Salt River Project. Catherine gave you a little teaser about what that is, but we are a water and power company, private water, public power. Our mission is to deliver affordable, reliable, and sustainable water and power.
And I'm Laurent Germain. I'm the CEO of Aegis Group, which is the French leader for engineering and operations and maintenance. So it's a $2.3 billion company with 20,000 people working all around the world.
Excellent. Thank you. So, Laurent, actually, I think we'll start out with you, if that's okay. If you could please describe the nexus and the way that water and energy interact in your company in the most influential ways.
I think, before talking about that, I think we face a paradox here. The population will grow 2 billion by 2040, which means more pressure on land, more pressure on water, more energy. At the same time, each time there is a global warming of 1 degree, it leads to 20% less of renewable waters. So, how can we reconcile, these two trends, which appear to be opposite? This is exactly what the engineering companies are here for, to provide with the technical solutions to face, with this paradox, because there is not always a contradiction between, these three terms. I will give you one example, which is a project that we have done in Qatar, which is very much, close to Arizona, as it is, as you know, a desert. So they rely on 99% on seawater. So it consumes a lot of energy. So in order to reduce the use of energy, we designed, Aegis for them, a system of storage, a system of 5 reservoirs and a way to manage the water so that the water collected is stored and re-injected only in summer, because there is, of course, a shortage in summer and a surplus in winter. So that allows, I would say, the state of Qatar to save, I would say, the water, to save the amount of energy which is used. And by the way, also to develop the area where these reservoirs have been built, because they have built also leisure amenities for their population. So, there is a way to get out of an apparent contradiction between, I think, these two terms.
That's a really good point, because I think it's helpful to remember that humans have been managing and moving water for thousands of years, right? The solutions are, for the most part, known. It's a matter of finding the economics and the political will to see them through.
And by the way, I think this example shows what you need in order to achieve and to solve this paradox. Yeah. First is a political will, a political vision. Second is investments. And I think, today the investments dedicated to managing sustainable water are not sufficient. In the state, it is estimated that you should double the annual investments you do in maintaining, especially the water infrastructure. So political will, infrastructure, and innovation.
Absolutely. Leslie, talk to us a little bit about the nexus between water, energy, and land use as it relates to the Salt River Project.
Absolutely. And I'm going to talk a little bit about history to get us here. But Catherine mentioned that thousands of years ago, this land was actually inhabited by Native Americans, by the Hohokam, and they lived and prospered in this Salt River Valley here. They left, they moved on, and we can only speculate that they didn't stay because of the variable nature of our water supply here. So they had access to surface water, but year in and year out, we'd have very high flows and many years of no flows. And so we fast forward to the turn of the century, and we had farmers living here that were dependent on groundwater and also struggling with the variable nature of the water supply. And so in the early 1900s, when Teddy Roosevelt established the Bureau of Reclamation to reclaim the arid West, the Salt River Project was one of the first in line and one of the first projects authorized, and we constructed Roosevelt Dam. That, as you can imagine, the water was expensive. And so we talk about the political will, the investment. And so one of the first things we did at the time was, while that project was under construction, was we developed hydropower to help power the construction. Then we realized we could sell some of that hydropower. And over time, we jumped on the rural electrification bandwagon and we became a power provider. And to this day, we are mandated by state law to provide water support, which means our power side, actually, the revenues from our power side support the costs of water. And that is how we found the economics 100 years ago and the political will to establish the valley. And I would say the Salt River Project was the first big thing. Ultimately, we built 9 dams on the system. We have hydropower at most of them. And so we find our way in managing. So the valley, I'll touch just as quickly on the land use, but originally this was all farming. And you can see if you drive around Phoenix today, you're not going to see very many farms. So what we used that water for originally has very much transformed, and where our system was very stressed, today, as we've urbanized so much in the valley and within our water service area, we are much more in a balanced system because homes actually use a lot less water than agriculture does. So that was something, maybe an unintended consequence or unexpected, but that's where we are today. And we can talk some more about what kinds of things we're doing with our infrastructure to help support Central Arizona.
And I think that's a really important history for people to keep in mind, because it's not just about what's happened over the last, say, 150 years here. It's what's happened over many thousands of years here in the Valley of the Sun. And we are, for better or for worse, a bastion of climate stability.
Yes.
And it turns out that you can plan very methodically and very proactively to overcome water scarcity. And I think that's kind of the story of the Salt River Project. It's kind of a fun one, too. Yeah. Okay. Glenn, chime in here. Water, energy, land use.
So your opening comments, I thought, were very strong, and that is, we don't have a water problem. We have not had a water problem. We have leadership and decision-making problems. We have a little bit of money problems once in a while. Companies like mine and companies that I'm associated with have invested tens of billions of dollars in water infrastructure in the state of Arizona in the last decade. The first, second, and third largest private water utilities in the state of Arizona are Canadian, and Tucson Electric Power is Canadian. If we as investors did not believe that there was any opportunity or a problem in this region, we would not be spending billions of dollars to bring up to speed a 1940s water infrastructure that these dams created in the very beginning. We believe that technology is there. We believe this is a function of making decisions, executing decisions. The aquifer structure here is so strong that we have an incredible leadway, so there is no immediate issues. But long-term planning, with the size of growth that the TSMCs of the world represent and the geopolitical reshifting that is occurring, we have to plan 25 and 50 and 60 and 70 years out from an infrastructure point of view. And as Chris Camacho talked about, P3s and private sector money are going to be the big part of the solution. Well, that's what I represent. I represent very, very large Canadian capital from owners, teachers, Caisse de dépôt, people that are interested in what is going on here, the economic success, the absolute infrastructure that was created by the SRPs and the APSs of the world, and how do we support and bring that more money and more ability so that during the next 25 years, when someone makes a decision to put $60 or $65 billion infrastructure in, that they feel comfortable that there's not just short, not just political 4-year windows, but there is a long window. And Arizona has that all at its fingertips, and it's doing a great job.
Agree. I do have to give some context to one thing you said.
What?
While it is true that Canadian companies are the first, second, and third largest of the private water companies, the largest utilities here in the state are actually public. So most of the large cities are actually public utilities, which is interesting. That came about in kind of a progressive era, like the 1930s. And so cities, for the most part in this region, own and operate their own water and wastewater treatment facilities. That's actually really key because it's very important to have control over your wastewater because, of course, here in the desert, you're going to reuse that over and over again as a valued resource. And I wanted to give that context. But again, it goes back to that long-term planning. I was at the helm at Phoenix Water when TSMC decided to make its investment in North Phoenix. And you can bet water was, one of the most important categories that we had to talk through. But it is because of the investments of the private water companies, the public water companies, the power companies, all of us as a region, that TSMC felt comfortable investing billions of dollars in our economy. It's super, super important.
So one more addition onto that.
Let's go.
We go back and forth on this all the time. So cities in the state of Arizona have municipal bonding caps, and infrastructure costs are going to become so big that bringing in private capital to augment cities' capacities is absolutely the key. And we already are doing that in the state of Arizona, and cities like Phoenix are leaders in showing how the private sector and the public sector work together, bringing in muni bonding tax-based capacity with private money. And that many, many other places around the world have not figured that out it's either or in many other locations. I'd love to hear from your point of view on that because you're in other parts of the world. That's
absolutely. You and I are on the same page on that. I agree. And I would love to hear from Laurent about that because you're coming from the private sphere and you're making these investments into public infrastructure. Yeah. And then I would also love to hear Leslie's thoughts because I don't know if you guys caught this, but SRP, the Salt River Project, is both a public and a private company.
Correct.
What I see is in a lot of the projects that we are designing, be it in Mexico right now or in the Middle East, for instance, on desalination plants, for instance, are PPPs. So involvement of investments from the private sector will be absolutely key for the amount of investments that is ahead of us. And this is already what is happening. We just need to amplify, I would say, this trend.
Agree. Mm-hmm. Leslie?
So some of the things that we're doing at Salt River Project, I talked about being in balance. We have a system, a very well-defined system. Last year, we had to release, because we had a very productive year on the watershed and in Arizona, we had to release about a year's worth of supply out of our dams into the Salt River. It traveled downstream to essentially a very small amount of it evaporated away essentially in the desert.
What Leslie is saying, I have to interrupt her here. What she is saying is here in the desert, we prefer to have our water up in our reservoirs and not in our riverbed.
Yes.
But go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a normally dry riverbed. There are some incidental benefits, but essentially it's lost to beneficial use. So one of the things we've been trying to do is look at our system and find a way. So our water rights are pertinent to our lands. That means that the existing water rights from the system belong to the lands, which are people here in the Biltmore that live here have a right to water from the Salt River Project. But any new additional infrastructure improvements that we can do, we can partner with either local public or private water companies, and they can apply for the rights to that. So we're busy working on wringing every drop of water out of the system. And generally what that means, either reoperation of our existing system or development of new infrastructure. And so we are looking at, we have lost on the Verde River, we have 2 dams, and we've lost a lot of supply because if you're familiar with Arizona, it doesn't rain very often here in the valley, but when it does rain, and when I talk about a watershed, that's the area where water is developed and ends up in our reservoir system. So it's up north. It's either in eastern Arizona, but it's all in Arizona, or north up in the Verde, the Prescott area. When the water comes, it comes hard, it comes fast, and it's full of sediments. And we've lost a lot of our capacity in some of those reservoirs. So we're looking at options and things that we can do with that. And we have come around to, we're investigating modifying the downstream dam. And actually what that means is building a new dam. And what we're doing is we're partnering with local water users, both private and public, to essentially buy into that and invest in that infrastructure. And that's our way then of developing the supplies, working with our infrastructure to develop the supplies and making more water and more reliable, resilient, flexible water systems, interconnecting infrastructure within this central Arizona area.
So I want to kind of pull all this together and agree with all 3 of these panelists, because as proud as I am of the investments that we have made in our desert region to provide for resilient and sustainable water supplies, those investments they're just no longer enough. And it really is very difficult to get people interested in infrastructure, right? It's not sexy. They don't care. It's buried underneath our streets. It's hidden behind fortified walls. No one knows how these utilities function or what role infrastructure plays. And that's the key, I think, to bringing in private money. Because private equity understands the value of this infrastructure. They understand the value of investing in it. And I think it will be those public-private partnerships that serve us very well looking forward.
So we took to Canada about 3 or 4 months ago 7 of the state legislators from the state of Arizona responsible for infrastructure. And we met with about 7 or 8 of the largest pension plans in Canada, controlling about $3.5 trillion. And remember that those pension plans invest 30 to 40% of all their money in the United States. And it was fascinating that the basic stories that we're talking about here of cooperation, of working together, and the simplicity of putting forward the real story of Arizona's infrastructure and water and the way that we work as utilities and private and public, they were stunned because these people are investing all over the world, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Singapore, and they were thrilled because as they're now shifting, deglobalizing components of that, they're now looking back to what North America is all about. And they are trying to figure out what the opportunities are. And the opportunities in Arizona is, again, decision-making and leadership, but it's, to your point, scaling. Mm-hmm. Taking the basis, we couldn't have a better foundation of water professionals like that sitting to my left. All of a sudden, adding to their work additional expertise and money under their guidance and their tutelage to make sure that we're doing all of that right, that this region will grow exponentially at the rate in which the economic development machine is operating right now.
Really good point. So let's pivot for a second and talk a little bit about, the innovation space in terms of water and energy. What has you most excited, right, in that space? And if it's so great, why haven't we got there? Loren, we'll start with you.
I think the experience that most struck me was the experience of Israel. You know, Israel treats 85% of its wastewater, and they do it with a lot of new technologies. And the state has invested heavily, you know, into these new technologies. And now, you know, they've been able to manage, you know, the water, which is very scarce and which is, I would say, a superior asset, you know, in the country, a strategic asset in the country. And they have succeeded in doing that, in investing in R&D and bringing really the most advanced technologies into their wastewater treatment plants.
Interesting. Leslie?
So there's so many really great things going on in Arizona, and I think we've made the point that I think sometimes we get a bad rap that Arizona is going to dry up and blow away, but we've done some really great things, very innovative things here. In the 90s, we started bringing water into Arizona via the Central Arizona Project and storing it underground for future use. We call it firming, meaning, you know, we know that a shortage is coming. We anticipate that. What can we do in advance of that? Our reservoir systems are in use, so we created a new opportunity, and we've stored a lot of water underground. And today we're integrating infrastructure so that we can have a methodology to recover that water and deliver it to the folks that brought it in and stored it. We're doing some really cool things on the energy side. So Salt River Project we are transitioning away from, we're going through a carbon reduction, and we're looking at developing renewable supplies. We know that there's issues with that. You know, this is a great place. Catherine said we're the Valley of the Sun, and we wear that proudly. A great place to generate electricity, solar power. But, you know, we're limited on the time of day that we can do that. And historically, we had power plants that we would ramp up and run 24 hours a day. We're moving away from that. We need to figure out how we can balance that. And so we're looking for something we call battery storage, but what we're doing is we're integrating our water and our power. So our approach to that is we're going to develop, we already have hydropower on our system. We implement something called pump back, which used to mean that we would pump the water back overnight when we had extra energy and release it during the day when we needed to generate electricity. Today, we have the opposite problem where we have lots of power during the day, and we're looking at developing a pump storage, at least one, maybe two pump storage projects up near our reservoirs where we will, during the day when we have excess solar power, pump water up into a reservoir system and release it overnight. And it is the ultimate battery system that can last 100 years at least. So, you know, we're looking at other battery technology. We don't know what the life is. We don't know what the reliability, but we're integrating our water and power to make our water more reliable and our power more reliable.
And Loren, I think that's what you said you were doing in Qatar as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it is sort of the ultimate nexus between water and energy, right? Is to basically create a water battery. Is that? I'm not an energy person, but it sounds good. Glenn.
Water battery, I like that. So let me make the statement that I love Israel. I love other places in the world. I would challenge anybody in the world to be as on top of water as the state of Arizona is on top of water. Technologically, legislatively, working with our tribal nations, everybody, as painful as it looks to people on the outside, on the inside, the amount of cooperation that companies like SRP, APS, EPCOR do is mind-boggling. The amount of technology coming out of U of A and ASU in water is unbelievable. The sheer fact that the previous governor set aside $1 billion for long-term water augmentation review, and that currently right now in the state legislature they have approved and a committee is working on what will happen 25 or 30 or 40 years from now, and we're actively in discussions on this at every level. That tells you that we're planning short, medium, long term. We have technological prowess at our feet. We have historical data. And now we're combining all of that. Normally that would just be quietly going on in the background. But because of this accelerated economic development curve that the rest of the world is pushing into this market, we're having to do things a little bit quicker, a little bit faster. And you're getting to see a little bit of underneath what's below the blanket and what is actually there. And when you start looking at what these agricultural professionals created with SRP, and remember that the bulk of our water in this state is still used agriculturally. So the real premise of what we do here and how we coexist with commercial development and agriculture, our entire water basis is built on that, all the way back to the hoop dancers you saw this morning. So I think that remembering that history is so important as we move forward. Technology comes and goes, but if your absolute value system of water and understanding it goes all the way back to hoop dancers, goes back to ranchers, and then you're adding the new stuff on top of that, and you can make it coexist, it works.
So I hear a lot of agreement, but I'm also just curious because this all sounds really good. Why haven't we globally, right? Why haven't we made better progress? Lauren, I'd really love to get your thoughts on this. These solutions are known. We said that. We agree what they are. What's holding us up?
I think there are many reasons for it. I think, all the stakeholders, they don't have the same objectives. So, the agriculture sector, the industry sector, the individuals, the state may not have, the same objectives.
True.
So when they don't have the same objectives, you need to simplify the system, first of all. So like in France, for instance, it was very controversial, the relationships between, the energy sector, the water sector. So we brought, all these subjects under the same umbrella at federal level. So now we have one minister who is responsible for all, what is linked with water and energy. So we don't have conflicting regulations because sometimes, conflicting regulations were taken. So it was very difficult. It antagonized the system even more. So I think on the governance level, at the local and at the federal level, I would advise that, these matters are under the same umbrella. So this is what I would say the first reason. Second reason was the reason of lack of communication. Nobody communicated on the price of water, and price and water has a price. And now, you should explain also that if you invest more in the water pipeline in the US, where you lose 1/3 of the water that goes through the pipelines, if you invest a bit more in the maintenance, you may have a savings at the end. But this has to be fact-based and explained to the population, which maybe was not happening before.
Interesting.
It's true.
Leslie, I'm curious for your thoughts, and particularly in regards to stakeholders with different values and ideas and perspectives, because I know SRP has to balance a lot of that, farmers and cities and tribes and mines and power companies and all of that. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. And I think that when we think about how to find balance, we have in the West, our water rights are based on prior appropriation. That's the doctrine, and that means first in time, first in right. So the first people that used the water and continued to use the water had long-term rights to that. So it may seem a little counterproductive, but that's why we were an agrarian society, and the early settlers here after the tribes, and I'll come back to that, were farming. And so that's why so much of our water is still used for farming, 70% of all the water in Arizona. And then if you think about who actually was here first, it was the Native Americans, and we have 22 reservations in Arizona, and each one of those reservations came with reserved water rights. And so we have a supply. It's very much in demand, and we spend a lot of time disagreeing about who has the right to it and who's allowed to use it. And I would say that the system of water rights works fine. It keeps us, it lays the foundation. But what we've really had to learn how to do is develop consensus among parties, often parties with conflicting interests, about how to move forward, how to share, how to work together, how to deal with shortages, and so it's been interesting. But I would say Arizona in general is very good, very, very good at that.
I agree. Here's a teaser for Glenn. My premise is that one of the reasons why we're pretty good at this is that there are just huge economies of scale in both the water and power industries. And so that necessitates that we spread those costs over a larger group of people to be successful. Glenn, agree, disagree, other thoughts?
It's a tough decision. How am I going to answer that one? So I think you're looking at a state that is young in economic development and old in natural resources.
Interesting.
We know farming, we know mining, we know water, if you take a look at the core components of it. But what happens when you bring large degrees of new economics to this region? The dynamics start to change. And it's like anything. It's sort of like that game where you sort of go around until the music stops. And to your point about there's so many constituencies, this is why I said earlier that the two fundamental things that I see are leadership and decision making. It's not technology, it's not water, it's those two things. And if you can take that malleable group of decision makers that you and I both agree are multiple and give them some direction and allow them to make a decision, things will move forward at a quicker pace. This artificial pressure that we're under right now with economic development, where 1 million square feet needs to go up there and 2 million needs to go up there and 670 over there, everybody, which means cities and economic developers are dealing with something that 10 years ago, water wasn't even on the discussion plate in most economic development agencies or people. Nowadays, when a company comes to Arizona, the number one question that the Chris Camachos and Sandra Watsons of the world get is, so, can you confirm our water position? And then a phone call immediately goes to your offices and the natural resource committees in the state of Arizona are now buttressing the economic development model that is occurring. And it's not going to break, but it is watching this ebb and flow. It's neither left nor right, but it's right here in the middle. And if the lines of communication are not strong and tethered, then things can break. But so far, I'll tell you, other than people whining and moaning about commoditization and the price of water, I keep getting the question, gee, Glenn, why is water so expensive? And I go, water's not expensive. Here's a bucket. Water is inevitably not where it should be. So therefore, the movement of that water and the treatment of that water actually costs money. Now, if you want to live where you live and you want what you want, then that means the water is going to have to come from here to there. In the case of EPCOR, with Samsung's plant in Texas, they did not have water there. So our people had to build a pipeline 55 miles away, buy a bunch of land, get the aquifer, and figure out how to do the water. Or in San Antonio, where we do about 32% of all the water for San Antonio as EPCOR, the Germans had to come in and build a 155-mile pipeline to a set of aquifers to make sure that that water was there. If they hadn't done that 25 years ago, what would happen to San Antonio? So we are at that moment in time in Arizona where our legacy model is holding beautifully, but we have to be very, very cautious at this abnormal growth curve that has been thrown at us, that it's going to test every boundary of our interactions as groups, peoples, cultures to figure out how to get the solution.
Really well said. There are a lot of changes that come with growth. And you can imagine that can be controversial in any community. But it occurs to me, it's not just an issue here in this region, but globally as well, because of course we are urbanizing. Populations move more and more to urban centers. And that does put a lot of strain on our water and power and stormwater and wastewater systems. And so I think it's something we all have to contend with. And I think that that is the space for the innovation and the investment.
Yep.
Thoughts on that? Lauren.
Yeah, but also, I fully agree with you. It's a huge business opportunity, but I think we need to insist on the sobriety. You know, when we look at the benchmark on the water used per capita in the world, the results are very different. It's 800 liters in France, for instance. It's 3,000 liters per day in the US.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, in a way, I'm not saying, you know, the US is guilty, whatever, but I think, you know, a bit of sobriety on the behavior side of the human beings could help also to solve the equation. Not only adding more infrastructure to the existing infrastructure.
Agree. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because what would a conversation in Arizona about water be without talking about water conservation? We have made tremendous strides in our region. I'm an economist, so of course I like to think that a lot of the strides we've made in water conservation have to do with the fact that we have increased prices over time and people are reacting to that increased price. But we've done a lot of other things as well. As an example, Lauren mentioned earlier that in some cities, 30-40% of the water is lost through the water distribution system. Well, here in Arizona, in central Arizona, we are regulated to keep those losses to under 10%. And that's a heavy burden, because that's very, very expensive and difficult to achieve. But water conservation is super important. And per capita, our water conservation has fallen very significantly, about 30% over 20 years, I believe, Leslie, if I have that about right. But you're right, it's not enough. We need to do more. So Glenn, Leslie, how do we do more? How do we do better?
So my belief is you can't save your way to success. You can save your way to a ratio, to your point, of 3,000 versus what's in Europe. That's decades of European thinking and experience that got you to that point. We're now in America going through a resurgence that we haven't seen since post-World War II, which means every system of what we have used and how we have gluttonized everything has to get curtailed, pulled back a little bit, and toned, put back in a box of some sort. But in the case of water, it's really no different than oil and gas and other commodities. It's never where it's needed, and it has to be moved at some point. And that means that at some point down the road, should growth continue, which is a choice for a region, water augmentation eventually comes into the equation. It's not immediate. It's not short term. It's probably not even medium term. But if you're building a $65 billion plant, you want to know what's going to happen mid to long term. And this plant that is here is the tip of the iceberg of what could be coming. And therefore, it's not that we need to solve the problem right away, but we as Arizona need to show the strength that we do as a unity in water and make sure that we've got 25, 50, 100, 150-year plans like Europe did, like the Middle East. You go to Saudi Arabia or Dubai, and those plans, sit and hang out with Assam al-Tamimi and those people. And guess what? Those plans have been there for enormous, hundreds of years. They've known what they want to do. America is typical American. We are last minute taking a decision and emotionally jumping on it and taking advantage of the situation.
I disagree. But keep going. That's
okay, I'm good. Okay, go ahead. Disagree.
No. I'm just teasing you. Leslie,
so
your
I'm
thoughts.
going to jump on that a little bit. But one thing I want to say is everything that Laurent is saying, you can see how it's, except for our water use, how it's mimicked here, how globally we're looking at the same kinds of issues, we're addressing the same things. We're very young in all of this, but the approaches, the innovation, the funding, the economics, it's all the same.
The batteries.
Yes, the batteries. Ultimately, we are very driven by economics. And I'll say, though, that I think Arizona had the foresight. Now, it wasn't hundreds of years ago, but when we were thinking about, I will say the Salt River Project was the first big thing. It was built pre-statehood. We brought in the Central Arizona Project. It was planned in the 40s. It was authorized in the 60s. It was constructed in the 80s. And honestly, that's what's allowed us, these renewable supplies is what's allowed us to grow to be the 5th largest city in the country. So we had foresight when we brought in the Central Arizona Project water from the Colorado River. Arizona established the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. And in the Groundwater Management Act, it said a couple things, but one of them is we're going to designate areas of high groundwater use, and we're going to come up with conservation. We're going to have mandatory conservation. Each water provider has to develop a conservation plan. And as you can imagine, in the early days, they were something different than what they are today. But culturally, we've had to grow into this. And you can see when we're in the older parts of town, people move to Arizona. Generally recently, they like the climate, but they brought their favorite plants and animals with them.
Yep.
And so, we don't necessarily look like, if you get outside of town a little bit, we look like the Sonoran Desert, which is a beautiful, beautiful place. And as we continue to grow, especially on the outskirts of town, it looks more natural.
Yeah.
And we're moving in that direction of being more reasonable.
Less gluttonous.
Yes, gluttonous is a good word. There is a graph that shows us that I think comes from our state regulatory agency that says 50 years ago, we used just as much water as we do today.
Yep.
And when you look at
Wait, but 50 years, so we used just as much water as we did 50 years ago, but we've grown by 6 million people.
Right. So you look at the increase in population, the increase in product and industry and everything else that we've done here, we're definitely trending in the right direction. There's still a lot of room for improvement.
Can I throw 2 pieces on top of that, which I think you've touched on a point that is near and dear to my heart. What they did in the 40s and 50s and what they created showed such leadership and such advanced thinking. And we got to the 6 million people. So now we got to the line. We fulfilled way more, and that system that they designed and built got us here. What if it doubles again? And what is the scale and size? People around the world recognize that it could double again, and they're willing to throw billions of dollars at Arizona right now. So the question then becomes, what do we want to build of size and scale? What you're building is pretty big, but if you're truly going to go 20, 30 years down the road and the 6 million could go to 10 or 12 million.
Yeah.
If you choose to go down that road, we need to be thinking like those people thought in the 40s and 50s and what they were going to put forward. And I challenge to this day for someone to show me a 50-year water plan that shows the projects that will get us to that point.
Okay, I got some for you, but we're down.
Be funded.
Fair. We're down to 2 minutes, and I want to give just last thoughts. So, Lauren, you have some closing thoughts?
No, thank you very much. I think I'm the only Frenchman in the audience. So,
non, ça c'est moi, je parle français aussi.
Yes.
C'est une Montréalais.
And it gave the opportunity for me to discover Arizona for the first time and Phoenix for the first time. So thank you very much. For me, the takeaways is one, it's a subject that needs a lot of planification.
Yep.
Second, it needs to be a non-controversial subject politically. So a lot of discussion has to happen between the different stakeholders before the decisions are taken. And third, private sector has to get very much involved in what's going to happen in the future. And fourth, innovation shall continue to be at the forefront, I would say, of the agenda.
Excellent. Leslie,
I think those are excellent, excellent points. And I'll say in my time here, in general, water has been bipartisan. It hasn't been, more recently, it's become a little more partisan. We had, 80 water bills at the state legislature this year, and a very, very small fraction of them will move forward. So we do have to move away from that. We have to get back to the reality. And we do have the luxury of having people come before us that had a lot of foresight, and we need to be the ones that perpetuate that. Yeah. We can't think small.
Love that. And Glenn, you got the last word, and thank you for tolerating my teasing.
No, you can tease me anytime. So my belief is that when I sit with pension plans that control $600-700 billion, and they look across the table at me and they go, how much money do you want for what projects to get you to what level? So the money is sitting there, and then I come back and I go, God, that's great. They'll throw 10-20 billion at something. And then I come back and I know that we've academically studied everything to death. And I know that we've looked at everything we have. What we don't have is a decision-making process that says, let's do those 4 projects, pull the trigger, put the package together, raise the money, give it to the engineering firm, and start it and get it to us in 20 years. That's the missing element right now.
Well, will you please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for a fabulous conversation?